Hello class, and welcome to our video review of Hamlet Acts 1, Scene 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so after Hamlet's friend Horatio, Marcellus, and Bernardo tell him the information about the ghost, right before we get to that scene, we have um, Laertes lecturing Ophelia on how to behave properly, and he essentially tells her to fear Hamlet, right around line 15, Act 1, Scene 3. Perhaps he loves you now, and now no soil nor caudle doth besmirch the virtue of his will. But you must fear his greatness weighed, his will is not his own. For he himself is subject to his birth. He may not, as unvalued persons do, carve for himself, for on his choice depends the safety and health of his whole state. So he's saying he's part of royalty. He's the prince. So even though he says that he loves you, be afraid that he might not essentially marry you. Remember, virginity was a big deal back then. They had dowries, and if a woman was not a virgin um, on the wedding night, it could be a problem. The marriage could be null and void. Those women were treated as objects, and there was definitely a monetary value placed on that objectification of women. And what does he tell her on line 35? He says, "The chariot maid is prodigal enough if she unmask her beauty to the moon." The moon is the goddess of chastity, right? A symbol of chastity. The moon goddess is a symbol of chastity. And he's basically saying only the moon should see you naked at night, right? Best safety lies in fear. Be wary then, he says at the end of his speech, line 43. And what does she say? "I shall the effect of this good lesson keep as watchman to my heart, but good my brother, do not, as some ungracious pastors do, show me the steep and thorny way to heaven, whilst like a puffed and reckless libertine himself the primrose path of dalliance treads, and recks not his own reed." Follow your own advice and practice what you preach, right? I like the analogy, the reference to ungracious pastors, and how a lot of times priests and pastors tell you to act a certain way, yet they themselves are not acting that way. We see that all the time, unfortunately, in present day culture and society. Same thing back then. You'll notice that a lot of the themes and ideas in the Shakespearean plays can be applied to modern day themes and ideas, right? Polonius comes in again. Brothers are giving their sisters advice. Fathers are giving their daughters advice. But Polonius's advice is very specific. He says, "Do not talk to Hamlet, hang out with Hamlet, see Hamlet, allow Hamlet to see you. It's done." He forbids her, and she says, "I will obey," because she had to do what her father told her. Now, before he gives her that advice, he tells Laertes, a few things about going off to France in terms of how to act. And on page 44, Act 1, Scene 3, line 78, we have one of the most famous Shakespearean quotes, right? He tells him how to talk, how to act, whom he should become friends with, whom he should, not become friends with. And he says, "This above all, colon." I love the use of the punctuation mark, the colon, to separate the two ideas. Comes after a complete sentence to set off, right? An idea they want to emphasize. "This above all, to thine own self be true. And it must follow as the night the day, that canst not then be false to any man. Farewell, my blessing season this in thee. To thine own self be true." You'll notice throughout the semester there are quite a lot of quotes from Shakespeare that have either become the basis for or are they themselves modern day expressions or have influenced modern day expressions. So, Laertes and Polonius both tell Ophelia to be wary of Hamlet, and there's specific instructions not just to not hang out with him, but Laertes says don't trust him when he says that he loves you and sleep with him. And her father says he doesn't love you and he's not going to marry you because he's royalty, and his parents will pick who he has to marry, whom he has to marry. And he says he doesn't love you, he just wants to sleep with you. So he says he doesn't love you, he just wants to sleep with you because he's young, and when I was young, I acted like this, and young men act like this. He makes some interesting points, right? And he invokes his own ethos, which makes the advice all the more genuine. And he says he's not going to marry you even if you do sleep with him, which you shouldn't anyway, because he's the prince and he has to pretty much marry whom his parents suggest that he marries. So, on to Act 1, Scene 4 with the ghost. Again, it beckons Hamlet. It won't speak to him in front of the others. Um, there's two quotes that I want to draw your attention to at the end of Act 1, Scene 4. The first is line 91. After Hamlet and the ghost exit, Marcellus and Horatio discuss what they've just witnessed, right? And Horatio says, he waxes desperate with imagination. Now, when you say someone waxes as a verb, and you obviously are not referring to putting a coating on a metal surface, um, it means to grow, right? So a lot of times when people speak in flowery uh, language, poetic language, they describe things with lots of figures of speech and metaphors and things of that nature. Someone will say they're waxing poetic, meaning they're speaking, they're growing more and more poetic as they speak, right? In the essay we read in the book, Poetry for Everyday Life, right? Essentially, you would say someone who uses a lot of metaphors, right? If they normally didn't, and all of a sudden they start using metaphors in their sentence, you'd say, oh, you're waxing metaphorical, right? Meaning you're growing metaphorical, but it refers to their speech. When someone's waxing, you grow more poetic, you grow more metaphorical. Um, so he says he waxes desperate with imagination, right? He's starting to go crazy in what he's hoping to see. Because remember, Hamlet pulls his dagger on them and says, I'll make a ghost of him that lets me, right? And he tells his friends, leave me alone. Don't try to stop me. Um, so Horatio has a very interesting take on it. He waxes desperate with imagination. And Marcellus says, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And that's a very thematic quote for the play and a very famous quote from the play. If you say something's rotten in the state of Denmark, you mean something's amiss, something's fundamentally wrong, and it's a problem from the inside out. Because the problem, something's going on inside because the old king is not resting peacefully in his death. He's not only revisiting them, but he's revisiting them in his armor. So essentially, something's rotten in the state of Denmark. When something's rotten, you can't unrot it, right? You can't, fruit rots, you can't like put it in the refrigerator and then it gets good again. Something fundamentally wrong at the core. And I think this is an interesting foreshadowing and foreboding. As you know now, the ghost tells Hamlet that Claudius killed him in the garden. He poisoned him. Um, And if he did, and they don't even know that, that's why it's foreshadowing. If you're sitting in the theater watching this play, remember, back in Shakespeare's day, people went to the theater to be entertained. So it's nice to get hints of things to come so it's not unexpected. It's a very long play. They would take breaks, but people wanted to learn about life. And so Marcellus saying something is rotten in the state of Denmark is a very poignant statement, because saying that something's rotten in the state is suggesting there's deeper problems. And if Claudius did what the ghost tells Hamlet, then there are problems, not just for all of Denmark's citizens, but specifically for Hamlet, because now he's going to have to kill him. So now this brings up the idea of justice and capital punishment. You may say, oh, well, Shakespeare was written hundreds of years ago, right? How can it relate to today's uh, political and social climate, well, what's proper revenge? If someone commits a crime, what is proper justice? The ghost feels that justice for Hamlet is to kill Claudius. Now, the thing about Hamlet, and the reason why we read this play first, is it's a study in critical thinking, because he's a normal person. He's a student. He's away at school in Wittenberg, in Germany, right? And for him, this is a big deal. I mean, we already know he's sad. We already know he's depressed. We already know he's got anxiety. We already know he's suicidal. And now, to flip it all on its end a couple more times, he's got to do what? He's got to kill his uncle. Now, we know he doesn't like his uncle, but he's a logical, critical thinker. He's away at school in Wittenberg. We find out later in the play he's 27. So he's essentially in college or grad school. So he's logical. So he knows that he can't just go commit the act of murder without proof, because if he doesn't have proof, then how can he justify it? And he would be no better than a murderer that he's trying to avenge. So Hamlet's in a very precarious situation after the ghost tells him he's unlike someone, right? He's educated, he's logical, he's a thinker. He's not just going to go and murder Claudius. He says, I'm going to put on an antic disposition, and he confesses to his friends that if I start acting crazy, don't tell anyone why and don't tell anyone what happened tonight, because he has to test the theory of Claudius being the murderer before he can even think about his revenge, right? So he's logical. Now, you may say, well, acting crazy, does he become schizophrenic? Is this multiple personality disorder? Maybe. Keep reading. Think about it. Shakespeare was writing about modern psychology before the science even exists. Hamlet seems to be depressed. He seems to be suffering from anxiety. He seems, right, to be suicidal, and then confesses that he's thinking about suicide, right? Um, he describes what seems to be panic attacks. And when he puts on his antic disposition at the very end of Act 1, Scene 5, he tells his friends, I'm going to start acting crazy. I'm going to start acting differently. How much of that is him pretending, and how much of it is actually his personality becoming altered, him taking on another personality? Is that healthy? What are the effects of that? So it's very interesting that you can look at these plays from a psychological standpoint. And I think that we can all agree that what the ghost is asking Hamlet to do um, is a very, very serious, serious act. And as a thinker, as a student, Hamlet contemplates and understands the seriousness of that. And that's why he needs to gather proof. He needs facts to support his inference. Well, how's he going to get them? By acting crazy. Okay, well, what are his other options, though? Claudius is the king. He can't just go in there and be like, knock, knock. Hey, Claudius, it's me, Hamlet. You'll never guess what the ghost of my father told me. He can't call the police. He can't hire an attorney, right? He can't call the CSI and comb the garden for, DNA evidence. Because remember, what does the ghost tell him? He did it in the garden while I was sleeping, poured poison in his ear. Now, for those of you who might want to write on this play in the future, there's articles that are written about the different ways in which murders were committed back then, and that was the most cowardly way, was to poison someone. Because if you're gonna do it right, manly, you either stab or strangle, but you have to use your hands, right? You have to literally deal with strangling someone or stabbing them. You get blood on your hands, and we'll get to that when we get to Macbeth, because that whole expression, blood on your hands, is very clearly illustrated in Macbeth as blood is that sign of guilt, and it's a traumatic experience too. Is Hamlet also suffering in some ways from trauma due to the death of his father, his grief, his mother's hasty remarriage, all of those things. So there's a lot going on here. And on top of that, now he's asked to revenge the supposed death of his father and murder his uncle. Because remember, his father's in purgatory. And right? He's waiting for his crimes to be burnt and purged away. And for those of you who are unaware of what purgatory is, there's a little note in the text. It's kind of that in between place in Catholicism where if you die and you didn't get a chance to confess your sins, because remember, he was poisoned in the garden, Another problem with the murder is that he didn't get to confess his sin, so he can't go to heaven. He's got to go to purgatory and hope that if he does enough penance, he'll burn away his crimes and he'll be able to go to heaven. So again, that's where that whole purgatory idea comes from, and so on and so forth. So religion plays a huge role. Hamlet contemplates suicide, but tells us why he wouldn't go through with it. And now he's got to contemplate and think about whether or not he should kill his uncle. And he has to assemble facts to support his inference. So, thank you for your patience. More to come. Stay tuned.